I think it's really important to study this period in American history for a number of reasons. I mean, one, for those people who are interested in the coming of the Civil War, and I would argue most Americans should be interested in why the Civil War happened. The situation on the Missouri-Kansas border was a very important part of it, and especially this question of whether Kansas should be slave or free. And this idea of whether or not slavery could expand into the territories, whether Southerners could bring their slaves with them when they migrated west, is an issue that that kept popping up over and over during the 4 decades or so before the start of the Civil War. And it actually, when it first became a major issue was with the statehood of Missouri. In 1819 and 1820, they were debating about whether or not there could be slaves in Missouri. There were, of course, already slaves in Missouri and had been slaves in Missouri since the territory was a French colony, actually. But still, there were people in the North, in Congress, who really wanted to bring this issue to the front and talk about it at that point when Missouri went up for statehood. If you had asked the Missourians, who by and large were people there were still people of French descent, but mostly Southerners, from the upland South, places like Virginia and Kentucky, many of whom owned slaves, they would have said almost to a one, yes, we want slavery in Missouri. But Congress didn't ask the Missourians. They decided to debate it themselves. And ultimately, after this huge conflict within Congress, they came up with a compromise where Maine became a state and Missouri became a state, and they started this process of admitting a free state and a slave state every time they admitted a state to try to keep things equal in Congress. But that all blew apart after the Mexican War, when the United States acquired a lot of territory in the Southwest. And of course they had the Louisiana territory that they had since the beginning of the century, but was mostly large parts of it were unsettled, including Kansas and Nebraska. And in 1854, some people decided, among them, of course, Stephen Douglas, that they wanted to try to organize that territory, mostly because they wanted to establish a transcontinental railroad across the territory. And most of the territory north of Texas they were not states. The territory was not, the area was not states, and they had to be states before they could really move forward with this process of the railroad. So that is why the Kansas-Nebraska Act, or as a Nebraskan, well, it was actually technically the Nebraska-Kansas Act, and so people from Nebraska are not very happy about the fact that the Kansas is the focus of this, but they decided to they came up with this idea of popular sovereignty, and really what it was a way for Congress not to decide. They had tremendous difficulty trying to decide what would happen in the wake of the Mexican War. What would happen in those new territories? Would there be slavery or would there not? There had been a large fight, and then a compromise was reached in 1850, which really wasn't a compromise, because they blew all the components of the so-called compromise apart, and then let people vote on items individually. So the Fugitive Slave Act, for example, which was a law that said that Northerners had to return runaway slaves. They were legally bound to return runaway slaves to their owners in the South. They voted on that issue, and they were able to form a coalition to pass it. The Southerners, of course, were for it, and they got a few people in the North to vote for it, and they passed it. And then the issue of California, if it was going to be slave or free, which of course the Californians had kind of gone forward with the process themselves even before it got to that point, but they voted up or down on it, and so it really wasn't a compromise, and it really hadn't forced people to make really hard decisions, because they could vote for what they liked and vote against what they didn't like. And so this idea of letting the people decide in Kansas and Nebraska whether or not they wanted to be slave or free, Congress thought was a great idea. We don't have to decide, we'll let them decide. Well, ultimately, they did have to decide because, conflict erupted in the state of Kansas. And it was really kind of unexpected. I think there were some people who thought that naturally Nebraska, because of that parallel migration that I talked about, Nebraska would be a free state. The people from Iowa would move into it and they would vote for it to be a free state. And the people in Missouri would move into Kansas and they would vote for it to become a slave state. But what they didn't expect to happen, and what did happen, is that anti-slavery forces, mostly in the Northeast, decided to get involved in the situation. And they started funding, they developed organizations to fund the migration of free soil settlers to the territory of Kansas in order to try to secure the state for freedom. And the Missourians had not expected that. No one had expected that. And in fact, the people from Missouri were very upset about it because they felt like outside agitators were interfering with what should have been, in their minds, a very natural process of migration. And that what should people from Massachusetts or New York, what should they have to say about what happened in the state next door to Missouri? And you have to kind of put yourself in the, try to enter into the minds of these Missourians, even though, today, of course, people would argue that slavery was a horrible institution. But at the time, that is what they had known. They had very strong beliefs about their property rights. They owned land, but they also owned, tragically, human property. And they believed that the Constitution guaranteed those rights. And they thought that they had the right to take their property wherever they wanted to. So there was that issue. And certainly all Southerners were engaged with the situation in Kansas on that level. But for Missourians, it was a crisis, they thought, because this was a state that was really an island of slavery and a sea of free states, if you want to think about it that way. So if you think about the geography of Missouri, there's free Illinois to the east, there's Iowa to the north. Of course, Arkansas, it was a slave state, and Missouri does touch little parts of Kentucky and Tennessee, but way down in the southeastern part of the state. And that border along Missouri and Kansas, there weren't a lot of slaves there. That was the Ozarks, and there were slaves in every county, but not tremendous numbers, with the exception of Greene County, where Springfield is located. So this idea that Kansas would become a free state, and then especially after free soil people started moving there, and some abolitionists, and there were more abolitionists than Missourians would have liked, although most people in Kansas were more interested in the idea that Kansas would be free soil than they were in freeing slaves in Missouri. But there were people in Kansas who were interested in freeing slaves in Missouri, and Missourians knew that, and it made them very paranoid that their slaves would escape into Kansas, that people might come from Kansas into Missouri and quote steal their slaves from them, and indeed at some level all of that started to happen. Maybe not in as big of a way as the hysteria suggested, but they knew that would open up a new possibility for enslaved people in Missouri, a new possibility for freedom that was much easier than crossing over the Mississippi River into Illinois. South of Kansas City, it's an open border. there's no river to cross. You just walk across, and it's not that, once you walk into Kansas, those slaves were free and safe. It didn't work that way, but the possibilities were much greater once, if Kansas became a free state. So, they started talking about things like, you see these quotes in the newspaper about how slaves will be almost valueless in the state of Missouri if Kansas becomes a slave state. And while that was not true, certainly those concerns were there.